The Western dating market didn't get harder, it broke. And outside the manosphere, it seems that it is almost never discussed. I am a Filipina watching this from the outside, so I have no team to defend here, which means that I get to tell you what I actually see. What I see is a market that quietly stopped working for ordinary people. Let me show you how. Quick caveat, I haven't lived in the West, but the pandemic in 2020 changed things for me. Jobless, just broken up from a 5 year relationship and in need of a new direction, I found myself deep in the underbelly of the self improvement world. My goal then was to become the person that I want my future partner to date and eventually marry and build a life and legacy with. This led me into the fascinating and colorful world of the manosphere. In the beginning, I didn't understand any of it. Like, I suddenly stumbled into a parallel universe with a very different set of social rules. Most content on this topic falls into two camps. There's the camp that says men are the problem, that they're lonely because they're emotionally broken and need to fix themselves. There's also the camp that says women are the problem, that standards became impossible and feminism destroyed everything. I don't belong to either camp, by the way. As a third party observer from another culture, this isn't a fight to pick a side on. It's actually a system to understand. And from the very many conversations I've had on the topic regarding the average man's plight in the West, I started peeling through the layers through the lens of my own cultural upbringing. And what I saw was different. What I see is not simply bad dating behavior. I see a market that changed its rules so badly that decent people inside it started getting the wrong feedback about themselves and each other. The dating market broke the people inside it, both men and women. And until society is willing to accept that plainly without picking a side or pointing a finger or causing division and amplifying the gender wars, nobody actually really gets helped. Okay, so let me set up what most people get wrong about this. If you go online right now, you'll mostly find two loud narratives for why dating feels broken. And both of them are too shallow for the size of the damage. Now, the first narrative, and this is the one you'll hear in mainstream media, in a lot of relationship advice content, and in think pieces, is that men are lonely because of their own failures. They're emotionally unavailable. They don't communicate. They don't do the work. They don't step up. They don't man up. I hear that a lot on social media these days. And look, there's a grain of truth in that, let's be honest. Many men do need to grow up, and women too. And I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But that narrative has a problem. It takes real flaws in some men and stretches them into a total explanation for a crisis that is far too big and widespread and too patterned to be reduced to a personal failure. And that's not a character flaw, if you ask me. That's actually a system failure. The second narrative, and this is the one you'll hear in the red pill space, in manosphere content, in a lot of men's forums, is that women's standards became impossibly high, that hypergamy ruined everything, and that modern women is not worth pursuing anymore. And again, there's some truth in there, and I'm not going to dispute that. The dating market did shift in ways that disadvantage the average man. And I'm going to show you some data on that in a bit. But that narrative has an even bigger problem because it takes a real structural shift and then hands angry people a target. And once the observation becomes a weapon, the conversation stops being about understanding and it starts turning into blame. And once you're using data to justify resentment, you've stopped trying to understand anything. You've actually just picked a team in that case. So, here's what I actually think. And I am saying this as someone who has no stake in either side winning the argument. Both men and women are struggling. Disagree in the comments, but hear me out first. The data shows nearly identical rates of loneliness, but the shape of that struggle looks different on each side. And the system that created it, well, it wasn't designed by men nor by women. It was designed by technology, economics, social shifts that nobody fully controlled. And it broke everyone. To understand how the market broke, let's understand first what it looked like before it did. So let's rewind a little bit. Before the dating apps, Tinder, Bumble, Hinge, OkCupid, how did people actually find each other? Well, they met through proximity, through social circles, through repeated interaction over time. You met someone at work, through a friend, at a church, in your neighborhood, at a community gathering. The pool was rather small, and I know that sounds like a limitation, right? But here's what that small pool actually did. It forced people to evaluate each other on things you can only see over time. And what are those things? Character, consistency, reliability, kindness under pressure. Whether he showed up when he said he would, whether she was genuine when nobody was watching. So those things don't show up in a 3-second photo swipe. They show up across weeks, months, or even years of real interaction. And the other thing that system did, and this is important, it gave the average person a realistic path to partnership. Now remember this word because it matters later. So back then, you didn't need to be in the top 10% of anything. You didn't need a perfect profile photo or an impressive bio. You did not need to be exceptional in 10 different ways. Often being decent, available, and serious about showing up gave you a real path, well, a true edge in the mating game. Average was still visible back then. And here's the thing that made the system work, even though nobody designed it on purpose. When the pool is small, people naturally sort into stable pairs. Say there are 5 men and 5 women in a small community, roughly matched in looks, status, character. Now, the most stable outcome is when number 5 pairs with 5, 4 with 4, 3 with 3, and so on. Not because it is mandated, but because if the number 3 guy or gal tries to chase the number 1 man or woman, and the number 2 does the same, and everyone is reaching for the top, nobody really ends up with anyone. The whole system destabilizes. But when people accept a compatible match, everyone pairs off. Everyone builds something, and the community is stronger for it. So, this is a perfect illustration of a concept in game theory called Nash equilibrium. In the context that we are talking about, when similarly matched people pair off, nobody has a strong incentive to leave. It's not necessarily the most exciting outcome, I know. You might even call this match boring these days. But it is stable, and stability is what lets people build families, raise children, and stay together long enough for love to actually deepen over time. A slow sizzle, the slow burn kind of love. That's what the old dating system produced. Not because people were wiser, but because the constraints of the system pushed them toward stability. Well, what the apps damaged was not really romance itself. They damaged the limits that once forced people to recognize compatibility, steadiness, and buildable reality before chasing fantasy. They destroyed the constraints that made stability possible. Now, was that old system perfect? Not at all. It had biases like class, race, geography, all those shaped who you even meet or who you even had the chance to meet. Now, I'm not romanticizing the past. What I'm saying is that the old system had a mechanism that worked for most people, and the new system replaced it with something that works for almost nobody on the average scale because everybody is trying to reach up. Growing up here in the Philippines, this older model still largely exists. People still meet through family, through community, through shared social spaces. You get to know someone over time because of the strong sense of community here, and friends and colleagues, referrals, of course. Social media has expanded that market reach for both men and women too, but still, people generally date in their lane, in their social class. More on the social class in a later episode. So here's the difference: the West is rich, the Philippines is still developing. Richer countries have shifted in the status game instead of a partnership game for survival. Many Western women these days don't need a man to survive. Well, at least that's what I hear a lot. Whereas here in the Philippines, you mostly date within your social class. Both sides bring close to equal value to the table, and partnership isn't about romance first, it's about survival. Here's what I mean by that. So, example, in my hometown in Iligan City, and with friends and colleagues from my call center days, the couples who built lasting marriages weren't the ones who found the most attractive partner. They were the ones who found the most reliable one. Did they like each other? Of course, that's the baseline. But they didn't pair off for chemistry. They paired off to strategize and survive. And me personally, growing up with strict Catholic values, though I wasn't really religious myself, my mother drilled one thing into my head, and the whole community echoed it: find a good man who won't let his family go hungry. He doesn't have to be rich, he just has to know how to hustle, to always find a way to put food on the table no matter what. Now, I'd be lying if I said the romantic camp doesn't exist here too. In fact, there's an old Cebuano saying that says, bahalag saging, basta labing. It's okay to only eat bananas as long as you love each other. Sounds romantic, yes? Well, this is very common among teens and young adults. But the community doesn't say this to celebrate young lovers. They say it to caution them. It's the line elders pull out for kids who eloped or married for chemistry and end up poor and hungry a few years later. Because the honeymoon phase ends and attraction fades. And if you didn't pick someone with discarte, hustle, resourcefulness, the ability to figure things out, love alone won't keep your family fed, darling. That became my baseline standard. And I stand by that. At least for the social class I grew up in, that's how it is. Here, character beats money, hustle beats status, reliability beats romance. What makes our market different and what's at risk if the West's broken patterns get imported here? That's a topic for another episode. Anyway, back to the apps, back to where it broke. The shift happened gradually. Match.com launched in 1995, OkCupid came in 2004, and then Tinder in 2012 changed everything. Each wave made the pool bigger, each wave made the choices feel infinite, and each wave made the individual people feel a little bit more disposable. And that brings me to the juicy part. How did we get here again? How did the dating apps change the equation? Before the numbers, let me give you a frame first. Otherwise, data turns into ammunition, and that's not what we are doing here. I want you to actually understand the machine. Researching this topic, I found a concept from game theory that I think applies perfectly to what happened to dating. I want you to challenge me on this in the comment section if you think otherwise. Okay? Game? So, every game, any game, has three components: the players, the rules, and incentives. If you understand all three, you can predict how the game will play out. And more importantly, you can understand why the players are behaving the way they are, even when it looks irrational from the outside. In the old dating market, this is the one your parents played. The players were the people in your community, maybe 30, 50 people you could realistically meet and get to know. The rules were set by proximity. You could only choose from the people you actually encountered in real life, repeatedly over time. And the incentive was partnership. What is that? Building a household, raising a family, creating stability together. Now, look at what the apps changed. The players went from 30 people in your social circle to 3,000 plus faces on your screen. The rules shifted from get to know someone across months of real interaction to make a snap judgment in 3 seconds based on a photo. And the incentive, and this is the part nobody in this space talks about, the incentive quietly shifted from partnership to what? Ding, 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 ding. Yeah, status. What does that mean? Your match became less about who you could build a life with and more about who validated your place in the hierarchy, who looks good on your arm, who made your friends say, wow, how did you get them? And once the incentive shifts from partnership to status, the entire game changes. In a status game, women hold out for someone above their level because the app shows them the top 10% every day. And men delay committing to someone at their level because the app whispers that there's always one more swipe. Both sides reach past the person who could have worked. And that's how most people end up with nothing. And let me expound on what reaching up means for each side for clarity's sake. So, for women, reaching up is the dominant pattern and always has been. Hypergamy, seeking a partner at or above your level, is well documented and biologically rooted, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's human nature. Unfortunately, the app supercharged this by making the top of the market visible to everyone. So, when you see the top 10% on your screen every day, accepting your equilibrium match feels like settling. So, women hold out. And that's the pattern the data overwhelmingly supports. For men, on the other hand, it works differently. Men don't reach up in the same way that women do. So, most men on the apps are actually casting wider nets, swiping on 46% of the profiles. But there's a subtler version of reaching up that applies to men. What is it? The fantasy of the next match. Even when a man matches with someone compatible, the app whispers, keep swiping. There might be someone better. Well, he doesn't pass on her because he thinks he's too good for her. He passes on her because the system wanted him to believe that it is premature to make commitments because there are more profiles to see. The illusion of abundance prevents him from investing in the real person in front of him. What I just showed you is not just a theory. That's what the data shows. Let me walk you through it. Tinder's user base is approximately 75% male and 25% female. So for every woman on the app, there are roughly 3 men competing for her attention. Already, before anyone even swipes, the ratio is lopsided. Now, let's look at what happens when people actually start swiping. A large scale analysis of over 7,000 real Tinder profiles. This is from Swipe Stats, which analyzed 294 million swipes, found that the average male match rate is 5.3%, while the average female match rate is 44%. That is an 8.4 times difference. The median match rate for men, meaning the typical guy, not the average guy skewed by the outliers, is only 2%. And it gets more concentrated than that. Research across multiple platforms shows that the top 10% of the most attractive male profiles receive approximately 58% of all female likes. Now, I need to pause here because I know how this sounds, and one may think I'm saying women are too picky. I am not saying that. Women are responding rationally to a system that gives them enormous choices. If you had 3,000 options and could only pick a few, you'd be selective too, right? That's not a moral failing. That's a human behavior inside a system that amplifies it. But here's what the system produces on the other side. So, for the average decent man, the apps became a machine that kept telling him no without ever telling him why. And over time, that kind of rejection does not just damage confidence, it distorts self perception. You don't know what's wrong, you just know you're not being chosen. You swipe, you wait, nothing happens, or maybe you get a match and it goes nowhere. And you do that for months or years, and something happens to a person psychologically when they are repeatedly told by a system that they are not enough. After enough invisible losses, a man can stop feeling merely rejected and start feeling fundamentally unseen. That is a different kind of wound. It changes how he sees dating. And eventually, for a lot of men, it changes whether they try at all. My fiance has something to say about this, and I will let him tell you his story later on. Now, back to swiping. The average male user swipes right on about 46% of profiles they see. The average female swipes right on about 14%. Men are casting wider nets because they have to. Women are being more selective because they can afford to be. Neither behavior is wrong in isolation, but put them together inside a 3 to 1 male to female ratio, and you get a market where most men are functionally invisible. And that invisibility, that's not just an inconvenience, that's where the crisis starts. Here's the part that takes this from a dating problem to something much bigger. In 2023, the United States Surgeon General officially declared loneliness and social isolation an epidemic. Not a trend, not a concern, but an epidemic. And the data behind that declaration is honestly, it's hard to hear, but I think we all need to hear it. In a Gallup study published in 2025, one in four American men aged 15 to 34 said they felt lonely a lot of the previous day. That's 25%. While the young women they grew up with, it's 18%, and the rest of the country, it's 17%. Nowhere else in the developed world is the gap this big. Young American men are uniquely, painfully alone. Now, at the same time, the overall rates of loneliness between men and women are nearly identical. Pew Research surveyed over 6,000 American adults in 2024 and found that 16% of men and 15% of women say they feel lonely all or most of the time. So, loneliness isn't exclusively a male crisis. It affects everyone, but it shows up differently. And here's where the difference becomes important. The American Perspective Survey found that in 1990, only 3% of American men said they have zero close friends, but by 2021, that number was 15%, a fivefold increase in 30 years. So men's social networks didn't just shrink for a significant portion of them, they actually disappeared. A study by Equimundo in 2023 found that majority of men from older millennials through Gen Z agree that, or they agree with a statement that says, no one really knows me well. Gen Z being the highest in agreement. 40% of the men surveyed met screening criteria for depression, and 44% had experienced suicidal ideation within the previous 2 weeks. Whew. This was a survey of over 1,000 men ages 18 to 45, by the way. If any part of this episode is hitting you personally, please reach out to these numbers. It's also pinned in the comments section below. You don't have to be in a crisis to call. And then there's this, and this one actually hit me harder. So, Pew Research found that 74% of men would turn to a spouse or a partner first for emotional support. Take note, not a friend, not a family member, their partner, which means that for the men who don't have a partner, and remember, 6 in 10 men under 30 are single, the primary source of emotional support doesn't exist. Think about that. 20% of single men report having zero close friends. No partner, no close friends. That's not a dating problem anymore. That is an isolation crisis, and men are dying from it. Men are 3.3 times more likely than women to die from what researchers call deaths of despair, meaning suicide, overdose, and alcohol related illness. Men account for nearly 80% of suicides despite being 50% of the population. Now, I'm sharing these numbers not to overwhelm, but because I think they matter. Not to win an argument about which gender has it worse, because both sides are hurting. But the shape of male loneliness, the way it manifests as invisibility, disconnection, purposelessness, and then silence, that specific shape is what's feeding the crisis we're going to talk about in this series. For many women, the loneliness epidemic looks like choosing to disengage from a dating market that felt unsafe or unsatisfying. That's a choice and usually considered a healthy one. For men, on the other hand, it looks like becoming invisible in a system that once gave them meaning, a clear path, a purpose. That's not a choice. That's what happens when the floor disappears underneath. Both experiences are real, both deserve empathy, and both were created by the same broken system. Now, everything I just described could sound like I'm blaming technology. I am not. Dating apps didn't create human nature, they simply amplified it. Women have always been more selective than men when it comes to choosing a partner. That is biology, rooted in the fact that the physical cost of reproduction is higher for women, which means being selective about a partner was, for the most part of human history, a survival strategy. That's not a moral failing, that's evolution. And men have always been competing for female attention, also biology, and also not a moral failing. What the apps did was remove the constraints that used to balance those tendencies. When your only options were the 30 people in your church or your workplace, biology was tempered by reality. The pool was small enough that people had to look deeper. Character mattered because you'd see that person again next Sunday. Consistency mattered because your friends and family were watching. So when your options became 3,000 faces on a screen, those constraints disappeared. Biology went into overdrive and both sides lost. Women got overwhelmed by volume and retreated into selectivity. Men got buried under ratios and retreated into silence. And the apps? Well, the apps made money either way. Now, here's something worth thinking about. Tinder alone generated $1.79 billion dollars in revenue in 2024. Billion. Billion with a capital B. These companies do not make money when you find love. They make money when you keep swiping. In short, your loneliness is their business model. Think about that. Yeah? So, before you blame the other gender, and I say this to both sides, ask yourself, who designed the system and who profits from your frustration? Not her, not him. It's that platform. Here's something to reflect on. The dating market did not simply become harder. It changed into a game that rewards visibility, status, and optionality while quietly punishing the very traits that used to help people, ordinary people, build a life together. It became a different game entirely, unbeknownst to the players, a game that most people never agreed to play. The players changed, the rules changed, and the incentive shifted from building a real partnership to winning a status competition. Now, in that new game, awareness is key in managing the consequences that come with it. That's why I gave you all those data earlier. That's why it is for. So, if you are one of the many average men who finds dating in the West hopeless but are still looking for something real, Time for a different strategy. Don't play the same game as the people swiping through 100 faces at midnight. Look for an exit strategy where you still feel valued and respected. I mean, yeah, you could stay put where you are and hope for things to change, but that can take a multi decade, multi generational mindset and cultural shift. Or you completely check out of the market and go your own way, like many others are doing. But if you're still watching this video up to this point, you're probably one of those average men looking for a different kind of exit and one that's optimal for you. This series is about that exit and how to get it right. Not just for the men, but for couples too. To my fellow Pinay watching, this is the world that he is coming from. Understanding it is only half the work because finding each other is only the beginning. Understanding each other is what makes the relationship last and feel fulfilling. That's what this channel is about. The Philippine Dream is showing you one exit strategy that can still work for you. That is if you're fully aware and prepared for what you're getting into. But before we dig deeper into the Philippines, though, we'll continue laying the foundation as to how we got here. I'll show you who benefits from the broken market, as previously mentioned, why the top 10% broke it for everyone else, and what that means for 90% of men who were told to just be themselves in a system that was never designed to see them. Why is this important? Well, because I want you to know that if you're looking at the Philippines as an exit, things work differently here for the most part. And it pays off when you are aware what broke your market and how to avoid replicating the same results in the new one. Before you go, I want to hear from you. When was the exact moment dating started feeling like a losing game to you? Not when you got rejected, but when you realized the system itself had changed. Tell me in the comments. I am curious to know your thoughts. If this is the kind of conversation you've been looking for, honest, no rage bait, no fantasy, and built for both sides, subscribe. This series is just getting started. Episode 2 is available here somewhere or in the description below. See you again soon. Bye. Taking a side or pointing a finger. And oh no, this isn't a fight. Men and women, richer countries, countries, so resourcefulness. Why do I trip on that word? Resourcefulness. Anyway, back to the apps. Back to the apps. Why is it so high pitched? Try not to be so anal about it because you need to sleep soon, okay? Okay, now it's gone. Probably should stop. Dang it. It's dead, it's dead.